Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 17. The Origins of the Cold War, 1945 to 1949. The surrender of Japan left much of the world balanced between the mass armies of the Soviet Union and the American nuclear monopoly. It was an unequal balance because the United States would not have used its atomic weapon against the Russians for anything Russia was likely to do. Stalin realized this and largely ignored the atom bomb, although his designer, Andrei Tupolev, successfully copied 4 B-29s captured by the Russians in the Far East in 1944 and brought these to production as Tu-4s in 1947. Otherwise, the Kremlin's assessment of the situation was quite mistaken. Stalin assumed that the United States would soon relapse into isolationism, as it had done after World War I, and would be fully occupied with a post-war economic collapse like that of 1921. Accordingly, he regarded Britain as the chief obstacle to his plans, and seeing that it was both small and weak, with most unpromising economic prospects, he proceeded to carry out his designs with relatively little attention to the reactions of either English-speaking power. These plans involved the creation of a Soviet-controlled buffer fringe of satellite states on the Soviet frontiers in all areas occupied by Soviet armies, and communist coalition governments beyond these areas. In both cases, the local communists would be controlled by leaders of their own nationality, who had been trained under Comintern auspices in the Soviet Union. In some cases, these communist leaders had been exiles in Russia for more than 20 years. The chief error in Stalin's post-war strategy was his total misjudgment of President Truman and, on a wider stage, of the American people as a whole. Some of this error undoubtedly arose from Stalin's ignorance of the world outside Russia, and from the fact that his terrorist tactics in Russia in the 1930s had made it difficult for him to get reliable foreign information from his diplomatic corps, which was shielded from contact with foreigners and was more concerned with sending Stalin the information he expected than with that derived from independent observations. In any case, the Kremlin misjudged both Truman and the American people. Truman, in spite of a natural suspicion of the Russians, ended the war with every intention of trying to carry out Roosevelt's original plans for post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union. In addition, having learned much of the 1920s, he intended to make every effort to avoid either a post-war economic depression or a relapse into isolationism. His success in avoiding these events made it possible to reverse his inherited policy of cooperation with Russia when Stalin's actions in 1946 to 1947 made it clear that cooperation was the last thing the Kremlin wanted. These accusations appeared most clearly in regard to Germany. We have already noted the Soviet subversion of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria by native communists returning from Russia under the protection of the Soviet armies. The same thing occurred, but more gradually, in Eastern Germany. There, the communists at first pretended to cooperate with any anti-fascist groups, but their unwillingness to cooperate with the Western powers in the administration of Germany appeared almost at once. They gradually closed off their occupation zone and refused to carry out the earlier agreements to treat Germany as a single administrative and economic unit. This meant that the usual economic exchange within Germany of food from the agricultural eastern portion of the country for the industrial products of Western Germany was broken. Instead, East German food was drained to the Soviet Union. To prevent starvation of the West Germans, the United States and Britain had to send in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food and other supplies. On May 3, 1946, General Lucius D. Clay, head of the American military government in Germany, informed the Russians that no future agreements would be made to ship West German industrial equipment as reparations to Russia until the Russians agreed to treat Germany as an economic unit and to give some accounting of their reparations plundering of East Germany. Both points referred to open violations of the Potsdam Agreement regarding the treatment of Germany. The Soviet Union justified these and other violations of earlier agreements on the urgent need for their own economic rehabilitation. There can be no doubt that the Soviet Union had suffered great economic damage from the war, possibly the loss of a quarter of its pre-war wealth, more than all the other victor countries combined. But the Kremlin could have obtained much more by continued cooperation with the United States than it did from its post-war policy of studied enmity. This enmity was based on a number of factors. In the first place, Stalin was misled by the false ideology of Marx and Lenin, which spoke of the inevitable struggle of capitalism and communism, of the inevitable economic breakdown of the capitalist system, and of the capitalist endeavor to avoid such a breakdown by militarist aggression. On this basis, Stalin could not believe that the United States was prepared to be generous and cooperative toward the Soviet Union. Moreover, Stalin was worried by the weakness in depth of the Soviet system from economic damage and from ideological dissent. The war had been fought on an ideology of patriotism and nationalism, not as a communist ideological struggle, and the Kremlin by 1946 was eager to get back to its communist ideology, partly as justification of the new hardships of reconstruction under the Fourth Five-Year Plan, March 13, 1946, and partly to overcome the Russian soldiers' admiration of what they had seen of the West. These soldiers, for example, were amazed to discover that the exploited German workers of whom they had heard so much had standards of living several times higher than those of the ordinary Russian. The discovery that ordinary Germans had watches, even wristwatches, was an astounding revelation to the Russian soldiers, who proceeded to seize these wherever they saw them. A third factor guiding Soviet behavior was the discovery that there was no mass support for Russia or for communist ideology in Eastern and Central Europe, especially among the peasants, and that the buffer of communist states along Russia's western border would have to be built on force and not on consent. The governments of these states could be recruited from men of the respective nations who had been living in the Soviet Union for years under endless communist indoctrination. But the unindoctrinated masses in each country would have to be held in bondage by Soviet military forces, at least until local communist parties and local secret police organizations subservient to Moscow's orders could be built up. The urgent need for this, from the Kremlin's point of view, was shown when Austria and Hungary, although under Soviet military occupation, were permitted relatively free elections in November 1945. Both resulted in sharp defeats for the local communist parties, because such an outcome could not be permitted in the buffer satellites farther east. Elections there had to be postponed until the local governments were sufficiently communized and entrenched to be able to guarantee a favorable outcome to any election. It was this situation which made it impossible, in Russia's view, to carry out the promises made at Yalta and elsewhere about free elections in Poland or other countries neighboring on Russia. The United States, through Secretary of State Brines, assured the Kremlin that it wanted these neighboring states to have democratic governments friendly to the Soviet Union. The Kremlin knew, although Brines apparently did not, that these were mutually exclusive terms. They insisted these governments must be friendly, while he insisted that they must be free and democratic in the Western sense. Since the Kremlin assumed that Brines knew as well as they did of the contradiction in terms here, they assumed that his insistence on democratic governments in Eastern Europe indicated that he really wanted governments unfriendly to the Soviet Union. They were willing to call any governments which were friendly free, and democratic. But Brines refused to accept this refusal of the ordinary American meaning of these words. These disputes over Germany and Eastern Europe, which were regarded in the West as Soviet violations of their earlier agreements at Yalta and Potsdam, were regarded in Moscow as evidence for Stalin's conviction of the secret aggressive designs of the West. By the winter of 1945 to 1946, the Russian peoples were being warned of the dangers from the West. This began in 1945, with attacks on cosmopolitanism and prohibitions of Soviet soldiers fraternizing with aliens, especially soldiers of the United States or Britain, in the course of their occupation duties. Early in November 1945, Molotov warned the Moscow Soviet that fascism and imperialist aggression were still loose in the world. Similar speeches were made by other Soviet leaders, including Stalin. By the spring of 1946, xenophobia, one of the oldest of Russian cultural traits, was rampant again. In September 1946, and again in September 1947, Andrei Zhdanov, the Kremlin's leader of the International Communist Movement, made speeches which were simply declarations of ideological war on the West. They presented the Soviet Union as the last best hope of man, surrounded by prowling capitalist beasts of prey seeking to destroy it. On this basis, the Soviet Union found it impossible to cooperate with the West or to accept the American economic assistance in Reconstruction, which was offered. The American Congress, in the last renewal of the Lend-Lease Act in 1945, had forbidden use of these funds for post-war rehabilitation, but other funds were made available. For the transitional period, these amounted to about $9 billion. These transitional funds were made available on a humanitarian and economic basis, and not on political or ideological grounds. Accordingly, they were available to the Soviet Union and other areas under communist control in accordance with the provisions of each fund. For example, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRRA, was an international organization which handled goods worth $3,683 million, of which 65% was provided from the United States, 15% from Britain, and 3.5% from Canada. Its grants went to 17 countries, with China first, $518 million, Poland next, $478 million, Italy with $418 million, Yugoslavia with $416 million, and the Ukraine, seventh, with $188 million. Beyond the primary humanitarian aim of most United States assistance was the desire to get local economies functioning and efforts to further America's basic conviction of the value of a high level of international trade on a multilateral basis. The United States was opposed to all restrictive trade measures such as autarky, bilateralism, or quotas, and had, as its ultimate aim, the restoration of multilateral trade at the highest possible level, with freely convertible international monetary exchanges. It was convinced that such a system would be advantageous for all peoples, and did not see that it was anathema to the Soviet system, which had restrictions and quotas on economic life, even within the country, so that, while most Russians lived in poverty, a privileged minority, buying in special stores with special funds and special ration cards, had access to luxuries undreamed of by the ordinary person. In the American plans for economic recovery, Great Britain, as the world's greatest trader, had a special role. The United Kingdom could not exist without very large imports, but it could not pay for these without large exports. Such exports had to be much larger than before the war, even to pay for the pre-war level of imports, because many of Britain's pre-war sources of overseas incomes from investments, shipping, insurance, and so on had been drastically reduced by the war. In 1945, the British balance of payments deficit was about £875 million sterling, and in 1946 it was still £344 million. To tide over this deficit until British exports could recover, the United States in July 1946 provided Britain with a credit of $3,750 million, with interest at 2% and repayment in 50 annual installments to begin on December 31, 1951. The interest was to be waived whenever the British trade balance would not pay for imports on her 1936 to 1938 level. In return for this, Britain gave rather indefinite promises to work to reduce its bilateralism in trade, especially imperial preference, and to release as soon as feasible its blocked sterling accounts. Lend-Lease was ended in September 1945 with the Japanese surrender, and all claims were settled with Britain under an agreement of December 1945. This canceled the American grants under Lend-Lease of over $30,000 million and gave Britain permanent establishment of British soil with supplies in Britain or en route, for a settlement of $650 million payable on the same terms as the British loan just mentioned. Assistance similar to these was available to the Soviet Union, but was generally rebuffed. Even in 1945, efforts to establish international emergency committees for coal, transportation, and economic recovery in Europe were boycotted by the Soviet Union, with the exception of the one on transportation, which was necessary to supply the Russian troops. Little cooperation could be obtained from Soviet authorities for handling or aiding refugees, except for their demands for the return to concentration camps or slave labor of those who had fled from Eastern Europe. On October 15, 1945, Moscow signed an agreement similar to Britain's, by which they agreed to pay, after July 1954, for the $250 million worth of goods on their final Lend-Lease demands, yet unfulfilled when Lend-Lease ended. But they refused to discuss any general Lend-Lease settlement, and they refused to negotiate for a general loan, similar to that made to Britain, although Stalin had asked for one of $6 billion as early as January 1945. An American offer to discuss such a credit was rejected by Russia as financial aggression on March 1946. The offer was renewed in April and again in September 1946. But the American aims of multilateral trade, free of artificial restraints except tariffs, like the American insistence on free elections, were regarded in Moscow as clear evidence of America's aggressive aims. One significant, but perhaps not essential, factor in the deterioration of the relations of the Big Three in 1945 and 1946 lies in the provincial ignorance of the three foreign ministers, Rhines, Bevin, and Molotov, who conducted the negotiations. All three were men of limited background and narrow outlook, who saw the world from a narrow nationalistic point of view and were incapable of appreciating the outlook of different cultures or the different values and verbal meanings to be found in alien minds. Nevertheless, it does seem clear that the post-war breakdown of cooperation was inevitable in view of the conceptions of public authority, state power, and political security to be found in all three countries. On the whole, if blame must be allotted, it may well be placed at the door of Stalin's office in the Kremlin. American willingness to cooperate continued until 1947, as is evident from the fact that the Marshall Plan offer of American aid for cooperative European recovery effort was opened to the Soviet Union. But it now seems clear that Stalin had decided to close the door on cooperation and adopted a unilateral policy of limited aggression about February or March of 1946. The beginning of the Cold War may be placed at the date of this inferred decision, or may be placed at the later and more obvious date of the Soviet refusal to accept Marshall Plan aid in July 1947. The significance of the latter date is revealed by the fact that Czechoslovakia, which accepted on July 7th, was forced by Stalin's direct order to Prime Minister Gottwald to reverse this decision on July 10th. One significant encouragement to Soviet aggression came from the almost total demobilization of the American war effort. One significant encouragement to Soviet aggression came from the almost total demobilization of the American war effort. Pressure from special interest groups, such as business, labor unions, and cattlemen, aroused public opinion for the ending of price controls and rationing, and obtained cooperation from an anti-New Deal coalition in Congress to end most of the nation's economic controls in 1946. At the same time came almost total military demobilization. In spite of Ambassador Herman's explicit warnings from Moscow in April 1945, and Stalin's declaration of Cold Warfare in February 1946, the American government carried out the demobilization plan of September 1943, which was based on individual rather than on unit discharges. This destroyed the combat effectiveness of all units by the end of 1945, when almost half the men had been demobilized, and every unit, as a result, was at 50%. The Army's 8 million men in August 1945 was at 4.25 million by the end of the year, and reached 1.9 million by July 1946. The Air Force fell from 218 combat groups to 109 groups in the last 4 months of 1945. The Navy fell from 3.4 million men in August 1945 to 1.6 million in March 1946. The most critical example of the Soviet refusal to cooperate, and on its insistence on relapsing into isolation, secrecy, and terrorism, is to be found in its refusal to join in American efforts to harness the dangerous powers of nuclear fission. Long before the test at Alamogordo, some of the nuclear scientists, spurred on once again by Salazar, were trying to warn American political leaders of the unique character of the dangers from this source. Centered in the Chicago Argonne laboratories, this group wished to prevent the use of the bomb on Japan, slow up bomb but not general nuclear research, establish some kind of international control of the bomb, and reduce secrecy to a minimum. Early in April 1945, Salazar wrote to President Roosevelt to this effect, and, on the latter's death, sought out Brines and repeated his views verbally. The future Secretary of State found difficulty in grasping Salazar's arguments, especially as they were delivered in a Hungarian accent. But the new President Truman soon set up an interim committee to give advice on nuclear problems. This committee, led by Secretary of War Stimson, was dependent on its scientific members, Bush, Connet, and Carl T. Compton, for relevant facts, or could call on its scientific panel of Oppenheimer, Fermi, Arthur H. Compton, and E. O. Lawrence for advice. All these scientists except Fermi were official scientists, deeply involved in governmental administrative problems involving large budgets and possible grants to their pet projects and universities, and were regarded with some suspicion by the agitated, largely refugee scientists in the Manhattan District laboratories. These suspicions deepened as the official scientists recommended use of the bomb on Japan, near workers' houses. At Chicago, 7 of the agitated scientists, led by James Frank and Göttingen, Nobel Prize 1925, and including Salazar and Eugene Rabinowitch, sent another warning letter to Washington. They forecast the terror of a nuclear arms race, which would follow use of the bomb against Japan. Later, in July 1945, they presented a petition seeking an international demonstration and international control of the new weapon. Salazar obtained 67 signatures to this petition before it was blocked by General Groves and Arthur Compton, using military secrecy as an excuse. After Hiroshima, this group formed the Association of Atomic Scientists, later reorganized as the Federation of Atomic Scientists, whose bulletin, BAS, has been the greatest influence and source of information on all matters concerned with the political and social impact of nuclear weapons. The editor of this amazing new periodical was Eugene Rabinowitch. The energetic lobbying of this group of atomic scientists had a considerable influence on subsequent atomic history. When the official scientists, late in 1945, supported the administration's May-Johnson bill, which would have shared domestic control of atomic matters with the armed services, the BAS group mobilized public opinion behind the junior senator from Connecticut, Brian Mcmahon, and pushed through the Mcmahon Bill to presidential signature in August 1946. The Mcmahon Bill set up an Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, of 5 full-time civilian commissioners, named by the President, with David Lilienthal, former TVA SAR, as chairman. This commission, from August 1946, had ownership and control of all fissionable materials, uranium and thorium, from the mine to the final disposal of atomic wastes, including control of all plants and process patents, with the right to license private nuclear enterprises free of danger to society. The AEC, as it functioned, was a disappointment to the BAS scientists. They had sought freedom from military influence and reduced emphasis on the military uses of nuclear fission, free dissemination of theoretical research, and a diminution of the influence of the official scientists. They failed on all these points, as the AEC operated largely in terms of weapons research and production, remained extravagantly secretive even on purely theoretical matters, and was, because of the scientific ignorance of most of the commissioners, inevitably dominated by its Scientific Advisory Committee of official scientists led by Oppenheimer. To the BAS group, and to a wider circle of non-scientists, the AEC was a more or less temporary organization within the United States, whose work would be taken over eventually by a somewhat similar international organization. As a first step in this direction, the United Nations, at the suggestion of Bush and Connet, and on the joint invitation of 3 heads of English-speaking governments, President Truman, Prime Minister Attlee, and Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada, set up a United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, UNAEC, of all members of the Security Council plus Canada, January 1946. A State Department committee led by Undersecretary Dean Atkinson and David Lilienthal, and a second committee of citizens led by Bernard Baruch, spent much of 1946 in the monstrous task of trying to work out some system of international control of nuclear energy. The task of educating the non-scientists generally fell on Oppenheimer, who gave dozens of his brilliant, extemporaneous, chalk-dusted lectures on nuclear physics. The final plan, presented to the UN by Baruch on June 14, 1946, provided an international control body similar to the AEC. It would own, control, or license all uranium from the mine through processing, and use, with operation of its own nuclear facilities throughout the world, inspection of all other such facilities, absolute prohibition of nuclear bombs or diversion of nuclear materials to non-peaceful purposes, and punishment for evasion or violation of its regulations, free from the great power veto which normally operated in the Security Council of the UN. The vital point in Baruch's plan was that it would go into effect by stages, so that inspection and monopoly of nuclear materials would be operative before the American atomic plants were handed over to the new international agency, and before the American stockpile of nuclear bombs was dismantled. This extraordinary offer, an offer to give up the American nuclear monopoly, technical secrets, and weapons to an international agency in return for a possibly ineffective system of international inspections, was brusquely rejected by Andrei Gromyko on behalf of the Soviet Union within 5 days. The Soviet spokesman demanded instead a reverse sequence of stages covering 1. Immediate outlawing and destruction of all nuclear weapons, with prohibition of their manufacture, possession, or use. 2. A subsequent agreement for exchange of information, peaceful use of atomic energy, and enforcement of regulations. And 3. No tampering whatever with the great power veto in the UN, since only the United States had the atom bomb at the time. The adoption of this sequence could require the United States to give up the bomb without any assurance that anyone else would do anything. Least of all, adopt any subsequent control methods which might allow the Soviet Union to make its own bombs in secret after the United States had destroyed its in public. The nature of this Soviet suggestion shows clearly that the Soviet Union had no real desire for international control, probably because it was unwilling to open the secret life of the Soviet Union, including bomb-making, to international inspection. The Soviet refusal of the American efforts at international nuclear control, like their refusal of American loans and economic cooperation, provides some of the evidence of the Kremlin's state of mind in 1946. This evidence became overwhelming in 1947 and 1948, when Soviet aggression appeared along the whole crescent from Germany across Asia to the Far East. In Germany, as we have seen, the area under Soviet occupation was increasingly isolated from the West and increasingly communized internally. The Soviet military forces encouraged the formation of a dominant German Socialist Unity Party, SED, under communist control. Local provincial elections in the winter of 1946 to 1947 gave victory to the SED in the Soviet zone and to democratic parties, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, in the provinces of the 3 Western zones. Austria was also divided into 4 areas of military occupation, except that it had a single central government of its own under the old Social Democrat leader Karl Renner, who had also been Chancellor in 1919. While the Anglo-Americans supported the Austrians against starvation by the use of UNRRA assistance, the Soviet Union was systematically ransacked. This destroyed all communist influence in the country, as was clear when the election of November 1945 reduced them to 4 seats in an assembly of 165 members. Only in May 1955, 2 years after Stalin's death, was it possible to get Soviet consent to a peace treaty and withdrawal of all 4 occupying forces, October 1955. Even the friends of Russia suffered from Stalin's pressure and his insistence that the Kremlin must remain the center for communist decisions throughout the world. In Yugoslavia, where Tito was originally as anti-Western as Stalin himself, Moscow's efforts to dominate Yugoslavia alienated Tito completely by a combination of economic, diplomatic, and propaganda pressure. The rivalry between the 2 Slavs came to a head at the end of 1947, when Tito tried to build up a non-Russian communist bloc by signing friendship treaties with Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. By March 1948, a complete break between Belgrade and Moscow was reached. Tito took his place next to Trotsky in Stalin's list of the damned, and the next few years were filled with efforts to overthrow Tito and the purging of Tito sympathizers by Stalin's cooperative jackals and the other communist satellites. Farther east, strong Soviet pressure had been put on Greece, Turkey, and Iran since 1945. On Greece, this pressure came through the communist regimes in Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. But in Turkey and Iran, it came from the Soviet Union directly. These pressures were probably designed to bring into power, in the three countries, governments relatively favorably inclined toward the Soviet Union to the extent that the latter could obtain a veto power over any collaboration of the three with the Western powers, especially with Great Britain. This was an effort in which Stalin had few good cards, and which showed his ignorance of political conditions in countries outside his own. In these three, as in other countries, most people desired two things: political independence and economic aid. Neither of these could be or would be obtained from Stalin. The first because it violated his imperious nature, and the second because of economic scarcity in the Soviet Union itself. Nevertheless, the effort was made. In Greece, the election of March 31st, 1946, gave the Popular Party, which supported the king, 231 out of 354 seats in the chamber. The following September, a plebiscite on the return of the monarchy gave 69% favorable votes. The communist groups refused to accept these results, and by 1946 were carrying on guerrilla warfare in the mountains, using the three adjacent communist states as bases for supplies, training, and rest areas. A commission of the Security Council of the UN studied the situation in the early months of 1947 and condemned Greece's three northern neighbors, but a Soviet veto stopped any further action by the UN. Instead, the guerrilla leader, General Marcos, set up a Greek provincial government in the mountains, but alienated much support among Greece's impoverished peasants by the banditry of his guerrillas, and especially by their kidnapping of thousands of peasant children who were smuggled into the three communist countries for communist indoctrination. Many of these children did not return for 8 or 10 years, and hundreds vanished forever. Large groups returned from Albania as late as 1963. The Soviet pressure on Turkey was uncalled for and totally unremunerative. We have already noted that the Soviet-German Accords of 1940 to 1941 showed Soviet ambitions for bases on the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, and for a sphere of political influence south of Batum and Baku in the general direction of the Persian Gulf. Thus, in this area, as in the Far East, Stalin resumed the expansionist aims of Tsarist Russia. At Potsdam, Stalin had looked even farther afield by asking for a trusteeship in the former Italian colony of Libya and a less definitive influence in Eteria on the western shore of the Red Sea. These aims were formally demanded by Moscow in September 1945 and in April 1946, Conference of Foreign Ministers in Paris. As early as March 19, 1945, Russia denounced its treaty of friendship with Turkey, and within a few months made demands, both official and unofficial, for Kars, Trebizond, and other areas of northern Turkey. Anti-Turkish agitation was encouraged among the Kurds, a non-Turkish people living at the base of the Anatolian Peninsula and divided among Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And the Georgia Socialist Soviet Republic demanded 8 Turkish provinces covering much of the Black Sea coast and Kurdistan. On August 8, 1946, Molotov demanded a joint Soviet-Turkish defense of the Straits. Only after Stalin's death on May 3, 1953, did the Kremlin renounce the earlier territorial demands on Turkey. But by that time, the alienation was complete. Turkey had been driven into the Western camp, soon allied with Greece and Yugoslavia in a defensive alignment against the North Balkan Soviet satellites, August 1954, and became the eastern pillar of NATO. The Soviet aggressions on Iran began in 1945, when Soviet-sponsored communists, under the protection of the Russian armies occupying northern Iran, set up independent communist governments at Tabriz and in Iranian Kurdistan. These were apparently intended to be incorporated into Soviet Azerbaijan, with the Kurdish areas to be taken from Turkey. But the failure of the latter scheme made this impossible. Nevertheless, the Russian army refused to evacuate northern Iran in March 1946, as it was bound to do by the agreement of January 29, 1941, which had admitted it. Only in May did Iran win Soviet evacuation of its forces by agreeing to form a joint Soviet-Iranian oil company to exploit the petroleum resources of northern Iran, a project which never was fulfilled. By the end of 1946, Britain found the burden of providing military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey too heavy for its overstrained resources. It was, moreover, eager to overcome the American aloofness in the Near East, where it felt it was bearing much of the Soviet pressure alone. Accordingly, in February 1947, it threatened to withdraw completely from Greece and Turkey by April 1st. On March 12th, the American president enunciated the Truman Doctrine to a joint session of Congress. This stated that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He asked for financial assistance to free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. His request for $400 million for aid to Greece and Turkey was granted, after considerable debate, in May 1947. 2 weeks later, at Harvard's commencement, Secretary of State General George C. Marshall enunciated the Marshall Plan, which offered American economic support for a European recovery program which would include the Soviet Union and other communist states. Once again, Stalin's ignorance committed him to an unrewarding path. He rejected this offer and forced Czechoslovakia, which had previously accepted, to do the same. The path Stalin was following took a more aggressive turn in 1947 and 1948. This involved complete Soviet domination of the area already under communist control. The shift of communist parties from coalition to opposition in other areas, the instigation of communist outbreaks in colonial areas, especially in the Far East, and the expulsion of the Western powers from their enclave in Berlin. All this was to be achieved while avoiding an open clash with the United States. As part of this process, which was badly bungled everywhere except in Czechoslovakia, the communists withdrew from the bourgeois coalition governments, which they had joined in 1944 to 1945. In Belgium in March 1947, in France and in Italy in May, and in Austria in the autumn. At the same time, agitation for communist-dominated trade unions was increased, and the first post-war large-scale strikes began at the end of the year. As part of this same harassment, the Soviet Union and the UN vetoed applications for membership by Italy and Finland. In the states already under communist control, the Soviet influence was intensified by efforts to establish a system in which the local parties and secret police were controlled by Soviet agents in the Russian embassies. As part of this effort, The Third International, or Comintern, which had been dissolved in theory by Stalin in December 1943, but had continued to operate secretly out of Moscow, was re-established under the new name, Cominform. This was done under Zhdanov's direction at a meeting of representatives of the Communist parties of France, Italy, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, held in Poland in September 1947. The delegates were told by Zhdanov and Georgy Melenkov of the Soviet Union that the world was now divided into two antithetical forces, the imperialist group, headed by the United States, and the peace-loving group, headed by the Soviet Union, and that it was necessary to re-establish direct operational control of the communist parties. The Soviet effort to obtain operational control in the party in Yugoslavia was vigorously resisted by Tito. As a final effort in this direction, Stalin, in February 1948, tried to force Yugoslavia into a federation with more docile Bulgaria. Tito flatly refused. As a result, Yugoslavia was expelled from the Cominform in June 1948. An all-out economic, propaganda, ideological, and political warfare was begun by the Soviet bloc against Tito. The conflict was used by Stalin as an excuse to purge all opposition communists within the bloc as Titoists. As part of this struggle, Tito closed the Yugoslav border to the Greek guerrillas, with the result that they, with General Marcos, ended their disturbances in 1949, and Tito became a recipient of American economic aid, which eventually reached $700 million. This process reached its climax with the achievement of a Greek-Yugoslav alliance in 1954. A parallel effort by Stalin to take Czechoslovakia completely into the communist camp was more successful, and was, in fact, the most successful of his numerous efforts to increase his power in the last 6 years of his life. In Czechoslovakia, the Russian-trained communist Klement Gottwald had become prime minister in a coalition government in July 1946. In February 1948, the communist minister of the interior replaced 8 Prague police officials by communists, was overruled by the cabinet, but refused to back down, calling out into the streets the workers, militia, armed factory workers, and the police, all 3 under communist control. To sustain his refusal, when the non-communist ministers protested and some threatened to resign, Gottwald threatened the ill President Benes with civil war if he did not dismiss 12 non-communist ministers. Benes, who had been determined to seek support from Russia and not from the Western powers since his unhappy disillusionment with the latter at Munich in September 1938, yielded to Gottwald's demands on February 25, 1948. He himself resigned on May 4th and died in September 1948. His friend, Foreign Minister Jan Masarki, son of the founder of Czechoslovakia and the chief Czech advocate of a pro-Western policy, died mysteriously by a fall from a window on May 10th. The communist control of Czechoslovakia was then complete. Stalin's victory in Czechoslovakia was followed by an even more dramatic defeat in an effort to eject the United States, France, and Britain from their sectors in West Berlin. Apparently, he believed that the United States was considering a withdrawal from Berlin, and that a Soviet push would hasten that event. The former belief may have been based on good evidence, but the latter inference from it was quite mistaken. American policy in Germany, for almost 3 years, April 1945 to April 1948, was a confusion of conflicting and ambiguous objectives. The basic idea, going back to 1942, was to make it impossible for Germany to wage aggressive war again. but no plans had been made, even on a tentative basis, as to how this goal should be sought. The basic idea, going back to 1942, was to make it impossible for Germany to wage aggressive war again, but no plans had been made, even on a tentative basis, as to how this goal should be sought. Two decisions left unsolved were whether Germany would be broken up and how reparations might be obtained from her without building the country up economically to provide these. Efforts by the State Department to settle these questions were blocked by other departments, notably by the Civil Affairs Division of the War Department, which wanted them left unsettled, and by the Treasury Department, which had totally different aims from State. In a far-sighted message from London in August 1944, Ambassador John Winnet warned that lack of an agreed reparations policy would inevitably lead to a breakdown of joint Allied control of Germany and to a struggle with Russia for control of Germany. These wise words were ignored, and President Roosevelt, to stop the bickering, postponed all decisions. Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau took advantage of this lacuna and his close personal friendship with Roosevelt to push forward his own pet scheme to reduce Germany to a purely agricultural state by almost total destruction of her industry, the millions of surplus population to be, if necessary, deported to Africa. The secretary, supported by his assistant, Secretary Harry Dexter White, was deeply disturbed by Germany's history of aggression and by her efforts to annihilate other races, and was fairly certain that an American relapse into isolationism would make it possible for Germany to try again. The only way to prevent such an attempt, he felt, was to reduce Germany's industry, and thus her war-making capacity, as close to nothing as possible. The resulting chaos, inflation, and misery would be but slight repayment for the horrors Germany had inflicted on others over many years. By personal influence, Morgenthau obtained acceptance of a somewhat modified version of this plan by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the Quebec Conference of September 1944. There is little doubt that Churchill's approval had been won by his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, who had personal animosities against Germany and had been the chief civilian advocate of indiscriminate bombing of German cities. The error at Quebec was quickly repudiated, but no real planning was done, and the Morgenthau Plan played a considerable role in JCS 1067, the directive set up to guide the American military occupation of Germany. In the same context, the vague and unsettled reparations discussion at Yalta proposed that reparations of $20,000 million, of which half to go to Russia, be obtained by the dismantling of German industry. The JCS 1067 directive ordered that Germany be treated as a defeated enemy and not as a liberated country, with the chief objective, that of preventing future German aggression. No steps were to be taken to secure its economic recovery. At the Potsdam Conference, it was agreed that the German economy should not be permitted to recover higher than a level which would sustain the occupation forces and displaced refugee persons, with standards of living for the German people themselves no higher than the average standards of living of other European countries. This rather ambiguous level was subsequently defined as equal to the Germans' standard of living of 1932, at the bottom of the Depression, the level, in fact, which had brought Hitler to power in January 1933. It took more than 2 years of misery for Germany and frustrating relations with the Soviet occupation forces to secure any change in these American objectives. During these 2 years, lack of equipment, of fertilizers, and of encouragement to enterprise made German economic and social conditions worsen until the end of 1947. Much of the country was still in ruins. Housing was lacking, Production of food and coal were in almost total collapse. Unemployment was very high. Inflation was rampant. Crime, especially from bands of displaced persons, ex-Nazis and juvenile delinquents, was widespread. And the black market, using cigarettes as a monetary standard, was flourishing. Hunger and cold in the winter took a considerable toll, and the Germans, for 2 years, experienced some of the misery they had inflicted on others in the preceding dozen or more years. Without a revival of industry, which was hampered by disarmament, reparations, and war damage, it was impossible to resume the two vital necessities of recovery: increased mining of coal and export of industrial products to pay for food imports. By the end of 1947, the Americans and British were thoroughly tired of paying astronomical sums each year to keep food flowing to Western Germany. All efforts to make an economic reunion with Eastern Germany failed because of Soviet insistence that such a reestablishment of interchange of food for industrial products between the two halves of Germany must be tied in with recognition of renewed Soviet claims for $10 billion in reparations payments to be taken from current production, 2 points which had been unsettled by the wartime agreements. To revive German industry so that it could pay for imports of food, the Anglo-Americans devised a reform of the German currency. The Soviet government objected violently to this because it might work, but also because it would inevitably bind West Germany economically to the West. If the products of a revived West German industry could not be exchanged for Eastern European food, they would have to be exchanged for food and raw materials from the West. The German currency reform of 1948 is the fiscal miracle of the post-war world. From it came 1. An explosion of industrial expansion and economic prosperity for West Germany. 2. The tying of the West German economy to the West. 3. An example and model for other Western European countries, and for Japan, in economic expansion. And 4. A wave of prosperity for Western Europe as a whole, which continued year after year and refuted completely the claims of communists or even socialists, and, to a lesser extent, the claims of American businessmen that they held the sole key to prosperity. The reform, which went into effect on June 1, 1948, drastically reduced the volume of money in Western Germany by exchanging new Deutschmarks for the current Reichsmarks, on a 1-to-1 basis for the first 60, but on a 6.5 to 100 basis for all over 60. The new marks were blocked in banking accounts in complicated ways which encouraged their use for production. The Soviet Union used the monetary reform in West Germany as an excuse for its blockade of Berlin, which lasted in extreme form from June 24, 1948 to May 12, 1949, although it had begun on a partial basis on March 31st. It began in an atmosphere of rapidly rising East-West tension. In December 1947, the King of Romania was forced to abdication and exile. Shortly after the New Year, the SED in East Germany was purged of any leaders likely to show independence toward Stalin. The Czech Takeover in February 1948 was preceded by Soviet invitations to Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland to sign military alliances with Russia. All did so, but the Finnish delegates in February flatly refused Stalin's demand that the Soviet had the right to move troops into Finland on its own decision. In Italy, on April 18, 1948, desperate communist efforts to get a strong foothold in the Italian government were defeated in the first general elections under the new Republican Constitution. This election marks the turning point in post-war Italian history, just as the simultaneous Berlin crisis of monetary reform mark the turning point in post-war German history. The Communists had participated in all three of Italy's post-war governments under the Christian Democrat Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi, but went into opposition in his fourth government, set up on May 31st, 1947, as they did in all countries of Western Europe about the same time. The new Constitution of January 1st, 1948, required a new election during which the fate of newly democratic Italy hung in the balance. The results were a great defeat for the Communists, who obtained only 182 seats in their Popular Front alliance with the left-wing Socialists, compared to 307 Christian Democrat members in the Assembly of 570 seats. The Soviet decision to push the Western powers out of their occupation sectors in Western Berlin was part of their General Soviet movement. It was accompanied by claims that the whole city was an integral part of the Soviet occupation zone of Eastern Germany, and that the Western powers were present there only on sufferance. To this, the Western powers answered that their presence in Berlin was on exactly the same basis as that of the Russians, the right of conquest. The Kremlin at no time admitted that it was establishing a blockade or that its aims was to eject the Western powers. Its aims, rather, were to close access to smugglers, criminals, and eventually to the new illegal marks introduced by the monetary reform. As we have seen, through the neglect of General Lucius Clay as Eisenhower's deputy in 1945, the Western powers had obtained no Soviet recognition of their access rights to Berlin from the Western occupation zones of Germany. Rail, canal, road, and air traffic to the west were under Soviet control and were constantly harassed by shifting regulations, delays, and open obstacles. By the early months of 1948, rail and road routes were tied in knots, and air traffic along the recognized corridor was jeopardized by trespassing Soviet fighter planes, intruding barrage balloons, and unannounced aircraft gunfire. On May 5th, a Russian fighter pilot, buzzing a British transport plane as it approached Berlin, collided with it and killed himself and the 15 persons on the British plane. On June 24th, all traffic by ground to Berlin from the west was closed on a variety of excuses, and only the harassed air corridor was open. Hopes of supplying the 2 million persons in the western sectors of the city by air were dim, as the population's need for food was over 2,000 tons a day, and the need for coal for power would be almost 5,000 tons a day, excluding home heating. Nevertheless, the attempt began. Day after day, the operation became more intense and more efficient, with planes landing originally at 2, later at 3 airports, as fast as they could get in. This continued night and day, reached 3,000 tons in 362 planes on July 5th, and erratically crept upward in spite of deteriorating weather conditions and lengthening darkness through the winter. In September, the city government, broken up by the communist mobs, moved from the Soviet sector to the western part of the city, but was replaced by a new, completely communist city government in the eastern sector. The Western powers stopped all goods flowing between zones to the east and began to merge the 3 zones of the Western powers, and took steps to create a Western German government to rule over them in succession to the military occupation regime. To indicate the temporary nature of the new system until the reunion of Eastern Germany could permit establishment of a permanent government, the new regulations were called a basic law rather than a constitution, and were drawn up by a council of delegates from the provincial assemblies rather than an elected constituent assembly. The new West German regime began to operate in May 1949, in the same month as the ending of the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade was won by the West because of the tireless efficiency of the airlift and the resolute determination of the Berliners themselves to undergo any personal hardships or death rather than to submit to another despotic government. Food was scarce, other supplies non-existent, and heat almost totally lacking through the winter of 1948 to 1949. Some starved, and many froze, but the resistance did not waver, and the airlift went on. Night and day, in spite of weather wariness and accidents, which killed 61 airmen, the planes roared in and out again. Soviet harassment of the airlift by night flying on instrument in the air corridor was never sufficient to stop it, as the Soviet clearly feared to push the dispute to open conflict. By September, planes were landing around the clock, every 3 minutes. Daily tonnage crept slowly upward, past 5,000 tons a day as the new year opened, and by April past 8,000 tons a day. One day that month, 1,398 planes, landing every 62 seconds, delivered 12,941 tons of supplies. The Soviet blockade had been defeated. On May 12, after elaborate negotiations, the ground routes to the city were reopened. In 11 months, the American airlift had landed more than 1.6 million tons of freight in about 200,000 flights, a demonstration which undoubtedly awed even the Russians. And in the interval, West Germany had been united from 3 zones to 1 and had obtained its own German government. The West German elections of August 14, 1949, gave the Christian Democrats 31% of the vote, with 139 seats in the parliament. The chief opposition party, the Social Democratic, had 29%, with 131 seats. The Communists, with 5%, and 15 seats, were in 5th place, after 2 other minority groups. The conservative, centralist Free Democrats, with 52 seats, and the moderate anti-Prussian Federalist German Party, with 17 seats. Though the first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, an anti-Nazi who had been imprisoned by Hitler, won his post by only a single vote. He kept it until 1963.